"Please, can someone just tell me what's going on?" she asked, her voice trembling as she reached out to one of the officers. He barely acknowledged her, continuing his search as if she were invisible. In that moment, Rachel felt a surge of fear. She had no idea what they were looking for, but it was clear that they weren't here for anything good. The house that had always been a safe haven now felt like a prison. She thought of her children, Emma and Max, who were upstairs getting ready for school. They had no idea what was unfolding downstairs. She needed to protect them, to make sure they weren't scared, but what could she do? As the officers moved about the house, Rachel's mind began to race. Could this be related to Elliot's work? He had always been committed to upholding the law, to fighting for what was right. But recently, he'd been talking about some sensitive matters at work, things that sounded more serious than usual. Could this be connected to that? Had Elliot gotten involved in something bigger than she realized? She hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now, standing in the middle of her own living room with police officers going through her things, it all felt much too real. She felt a knot form in her stomach as she realized that whatever was happening now could be tied to her husband. But why hadn't he told her anything? Why was she being left in the dark? Rachel tried to steady her breath, forcing herself to think. This wasn't just about her anymore, it was about her family. She needed to get to the bottom of this, and fast. Just as she was about to step forward and demand some answers, the sound of the front door opening caught her attention. Her heart leapt in her chest. It was Elliot. "Rachel?" His voice was filled with confusion as he stepped into the doorway. His eyes quickly scanned the room, taking in the sight of the officers moving about the house. He froze for a moment, clearly stunned. "What's going on here?" Rachel opened her mouth to explain, but before she could speak, the officer who had been leading the search turned toward Elliot with a look of recognition. "We're conducting a search, Commissioner," the officer said with a grim tone. "You're going to have to step aside." Elliot's face hardened as he looked from the officer to Rachel. "What is this?" he asked, his voice calm but with an edge of authority. "Why are you searching my house?" The tension in the room thickened, and Rachel's heart pounded in her chest as she watched the interaction unfold. The officers had just begun searching her home, and now her husband had arrived. Whatever had been building over the past few minutes was about to explode. The calm, controlled world she thought she knew was slipping away, and Rachel had no idea what was about to happen next. But there was one thing she knew for sure: this was no ordinary day. The life they had built, the life she had trusted, was about to be torn apart in ways she couldn't even begin to comprehend. Elliot stood in the doorway, his brow furrowed as he processed the scene unfolding before him. His mind raced, trying to piece together what was happening, but nothing made sense. The police, his own officers, had just barged into his home, and his wife, Rachel, stood there with wide eyes, her hands trembling as she tried to understand the gravity of the situation. The officers, some of whom Elliot recognized by face but not by name, continued their search without a word, going through every room with methodical precision. Rachel was frozen in place, her eyes flickering between the officers and her husband. She had never seen Elliot like this before, always calm, always in control, but now, there was something different in his expression. For the first time in years, Rachel saw a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes. This wasn't just an ordinary raid, this was personal. But why? Elliot's pulse quickened as his gaze shifted to the officer in charge, the one who had spoken to Rachel earlier. He stepped forward, his voice measured but firm. "What is this? Why are you in my house?" The officer, a man named Lieutenant Roberts, met Elliot's eyes with a cold, unwavering stare. "We have a warrant, Commissioner. We need to conduct a search." "I don't care about your warrant," Elliot said, his voice sharper now. "You don't get to just show up at my house without an explanation." His tone was authoritative, but there was a flicker of something else, something that made Rachel's heart race with uncertainty. "Elliot, what's going on?" Rachel asked, her voice barely above a whisper, but her eyes wide with confusion. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest, suffocating her. "Why are they here? What's happening?" Elliot turned to her, his expression softening for a split second, but only just enough for her to see the concern in his eyes. He reached out to her, but before he could speak, Lieutenant Roberts cut him off. "Commissioner," Roberts said, his voice dripping with disdain, "I suggest you let us do our job. If you want to avoid making things more complicated, step aside." Rachel's heart skipped a beat. She had never seen Elliot back down from anyone, let alone an officer. But there was something about the way Roberts spoke, like he knew something Elliot didn't. Something more sinister, something that seemed to be unraveling right before their eyes. Elliot stood still for a moment, weighing his options. There was a tension in the air, a crackling energy, and for a brief moment, Rachel could see the wheels turning in his mind. His face was unreadable, and she couldn't tell if he was angry, scared, or just in complete disbelief. Finally, Elliot took a deep breath and stepped aside. He didn't have a choice. "Fine," Elliot said quietly. "But you explain this to me later." Roberts didn't respond, instead gesturing to his officers to continue their search. Rachel could hear them moving upstairs, rummaging through her children's rooms, their voices hushed but filled with authority. The sense of violation was overwhelming. This wasn't just a police raid, it was an invasion of everything she had ever known. The privacy of their home was being shredded apart before her very eyes. She felt a chill run down her spine as she realized that nothing was off-limits now. Rachel turned to Elliot, her voice barely audible. "What is going on? Why didn't you tell me anything?" Elliot opened his mouth to speak, but the words didn't come out right away. He looked like he was struggling to find a way to explain the truth, but he couldn't quite bring himself to do it. Instead, he lowered his voice and took her by the arm, leading her to the kitchen where they could speak privately. "I didn't want to worry you, Rachel," he said, his voice tight with stress. "I didn't think it would come to this." Rachel's heart pounded. "Come to what? What are you talking about? What have you gotten yourself into?" Elliot's face was pale, his jaw clenched. "There are things going on with the police force. Things that go much deeper than anyone realizes. I've been investigating some of our own officers, Rachel." Rachel stared at him, completely dumbfounded. She couldn't comprehend the weight of his words. "What? Investigating? Why didn't you tell me? I didn't want to drag you into it. You know how dangerous it is. I've been looking into corruption within the department, and things got complicated." His voice trailed off, and for a brief moment, Rachel could see the toll it had taken on him. "Corruption?" Rachel whispered, her voice quivering. "But you're the commissioner. You're supposed to be above all of this." "I thought I was," Elliot said quietly, his eyes dark with guilt. "But the more I uncovered, the more I realized I had to take action. There are people in this town who are involved in things I can't ignore. I've been trying to expose them, but I didn't expect it to get this far." Rachel's mind spun as she tried to process the magnitude of what Elliot was saying. Her husband, the man she had trusted with everything, had been working undercover to expose police corruption, and she had no idea. She felt a strange mix of betrayal and admiration. How had he managed to keep this from her? And yet, there was a part of her that couldn't help but feel proud of him, even if it meant everything they had worked for might crumble around them. But before Rachel could say anything else, there was a loud crash from upstairs, followed by shouting. Her heart skipped a beat as she rushed toward the stairs, but Elliot grabbed her arm. "Stay here, Rachel. I don't want you involved in this." "I'm not going to stay here while they tear apart our home," she snapped, pulling away from him. "What if they find something? What if they use this against you?" Elliot's eyes flashed with a mixture of determination and fear. "I'll handle it. Just stay calm." But Rachel wasn't calm. Nothing about this situation felt right. The officers were still upstairs, moving swiftly from room to room, and Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't just looking for evidence, they were trying to intimidate her family, to break them down. And she didn't know if Elliot could stop them. As the moments passed, Rachel's mind raced with 100 different possibilities. What if Elliot's investigation had gone too far? What if this was the beginning of the end for their family? Was he really the man she thought he was, or had everything been a lie? And then, as if answering her unspoken question, the door to the study slammed open, and one of the officers walked out, holding a small envelope in his hand. His eyes met Elliot's with a look of recognition, one that sent a shiver down Rachel's spine. "We need to talk," the officer said, his voice cold and unreadable. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. Whatever was happening now, it was bigger than any of them could have imagined. And with that one simple sentence, she knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The officer who stepped into the study with the envelope seemed different from the others. He wasn't one of the regular patrol officers, but a higher-ranking detective, someone with a quiet but unsettling presence. His uniform was immaculate, and his face was as cold as the steel of the badge on his chest. As he locked eyes with Elliot, a palpable tension filled the room, like an unspoken challenge that neither of them was willing to back down from. Elliot stood his ground, his expression hardening as the officer handed him the envelope without saying a word. Rachel watched from the doorway, her breath shallow and her heart racing. The air felt thick, as if the walls themselves were closing in on her. What was in that envelope? What was going on? Everything around her was spiraling out of control, and she had no idea how to stop it. Elliot carefully opened the envelope, his hand steady but his brow furrowed with anxiety. As he pulled out a stack of papers, he glanced through them quickly, his eyes narrowing with confusion and frustration. The pages were filled with legal jargon, names, and figures, none of which meant anything to Rachel. But the look on Elliot's face told her everything she needed to know. This wasn't just a simple search or a misunderstanding. Something much darker was unfolding. "Commissioner," the officer said, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife, "this is a formal notice of investigation. You've been named as part of an ongoing probe into corruption and misconduct within the police department. This is no longer just an internal matter. We're escalating to a full-scale investigation, and you're a person of interest." Rachel's breath caught in her throat. Her mind spun with the words she had just heard. Elliot, the man she loved, the man she had trusted, was now under investigation. It didn't make sense. How could this be happening? She had always known him to be a man of integrity, someone who would never compromise his morals, someone who would always do the right thing. But now, all of that was being questioned. Elliot's face paled as the officer's words sank in. His jaw clenched, his eyes flashing with anger. "I'm being investigated," he asked, his voice low, dangerous. "By my own department?" The officer didn't flinch. "Yes, Commissioner. You're being investigated for alleged involvement in illegal activities. The documents you see there are part of the evidence we've gathered. We've been monitoring your actions for some time now, and the investigation has led us to you." Rachel could feel her legs wobble beneath her as she tried to process the words. The room felt like it was spinning, and the world she knew seemed to be unraveling in front of her. She had never seen Elliot like this, never seen him so rattled. He was always the rock, the one who kept things together. But now, the man she had always relied on was crumbling before her eyes. "No," Elliot said, shaking his head. "This isn't right. This is a setup. I've been investigating corruption in the department. I've been trying to clean up the force, not be part of it." His voice grew more desperate with each word. "This is an attack on me. On everything I've worked for. I'm being framed. The officer's expression remained unmoved, as if he had heard this kind of defense many times before. "We've seen the evidence, Commissioner. The investigation speaks for itself. You're involved in something much bigger than you realize." Rachel's thoughts were racing. What evidence? What had her husband gotten involved in? She wanted to believe him. She wanted to trust that he was telling the truth, that there was some mistake. But the coldness in the officer's eyes made her doubt. She couldn't ignore the possibility that Elliot had indeed crossed a line. But if he had, why had he kept this from her? Why hadn't he confided in her? "Elliot," Rachel said, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and confusion. "Is this true? Are you involved in something illegal?" She had to ask. She had to know. She couldn't keep living in a cloud of uncertainty, wondering if the man she loved had been lying to her all this time. Elliot's face softened, but there was a rawness in his eyes that Rachel had never seen before. For a moment, she thought he might break down, that he might finally reveal the truth, whatever it was. But instead, he stood tall, his posture rigid with pride, as if trying to hold on to some semblance of dignity. "No, Rachel. I swear to you, I'm not involved in anything illegal. You have to believe me. This is a setup." His voice was filled with conviction, but Rachel wasn't sure. Doubt had begun to creep into her mind, like a dark shadow slowly swallowing everything she had once believed to be true. The officer cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "The evidence we have speaks volumes, Commissioner. You're implicated in a network of illicit activities. There are phone records, financial transactions, and witness testimonies that all point to your involvement. Your investigation into corruption may have uncovered something much darker than you anticipated." Rachel's world seemed to shatter. She looked at Elliot, her heart sinking into her chest. How could this be happening? How could someone as honorable as him be tangled up in something so vile? She wanted to scream, to demand answers, but her voice caught in her throat. The truth was slipping away from her, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The officer looked at her, his eyes cold and calculating. "Mrs. Morgan, we're going to need you to cooperate. We may need to question you further, but for now, you're not under suspicion. However, I suggest you prepare for what's coming. This investigation will be public, and it will tear apart everything your family has built." Rachel's head spun. Public? The thought of the entire town finding out about this was almost too much to bear. What would they say about Elliot? What would they think of her? The thought of being scrutinized by everyone they knew, of having their lives laid bare, made her stomach twist in knots. Elliot stepped forward, his voice fierce and unwavering. "I won't let this ruin my family. I won't let anyone destroy the work I've done to make this town better. I'll fight this, Rachel. I promise you." But as Elliot spoke, Rachel couldn't help but feel a sinking sensation in her chest. She wanted to believe him, but the seeds of doubt had already been planted. What if Elliot had been too deep into this world of corruption? What if he had made mistakes that could cost him everything? And more importantly, what if those mistakes had already begun to cost them their future? The weight of the question loomed over her like a dark cloud, one that threatened to swallow them both whole. The officer turned and walked away, leaving Rachel and Elliot standing in the silence of their own home. The sense of finality hung in the air. Whatever had begun that morning, whatever had shattered their world, was far from over. And the future they had built, the life they had dreamed of, was now hanging by a thread, ready to unravel with the next piece of evidence, the next revelation, the next twist in a story that neither of them was prepared for. The next few days were a blur of anxiety and disbelief. Rachel tried to go about her daily routine, but everything felt off, like she was walking through a fog. Every corner of their home seemed to whisper of secrets, of things left unsaid, of a life that was no longer the same. The morning after the officer's visit, Elliot had disappeared into his office, locking the door behind him. He hadn't said much to her, except that he was going to handle the situation. But Rachel could see the cracks in his composure, the way his hands trembled when he thought no one was looking. He was unraveling, and so was she. The town was buzzing with whispers. Rachel could feel the eyes on her whenever she left the house, the murmur of conversations that stopped as soon as she entered a room. People were talking, and she couldn't escape it. Her husband, the respected commissioner, was under investigation. No one seemed to care about the details. The fact that he was even remotely involved in this scandal was enough to ruin their reputation. The community that had once supported Elliot was now turning against him, slowly and painfully, like a tidal wave pulling everything in its path. Rachel had always been the supportive wife, the one who stood by Elliot through thick and thin. But this felt different. There was no clear enemy, no one to confront, no clear path forward. Instead, there was this growing sense of isolation, like she and Elliot were being swallowed by a storm, with no one around them willing to offer shelter. Late one night, as the house fell silent except for the soft hum of the refrigerator, Rachel found herself sitting alone in the living room, staring out at the empty street through the window. She was lost in thought when the sudden sound of a car pulling up snapped her out of her reverie. She looked up and saw Elliot's car parked in the driveway. He hadn't been home all day, and she couldn't remember the last time they had spoken at length. She hadn't even asked where he'd been, too afraid of the answer. As she walked to the door, she tried to steady her breathing. She hadn't seen him this distant in years, and it scared her. When she opened the door, Elliot was standing on the porch, his posture tense, like he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. His eyes, which had always been filled with warmth, now looked dark and distant, as though he was already miles away from her. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice sounding more hollow than usual. Rachel nodded, stepping aside to let him in. He didn't move right away. Instead, he looked past her, as if searching for something in the shadows. For a moment, the distance between them felt unbridgeable, like they were two strangers in a house they once called home. "Rachel," he began, his voice low and strained, "this is bigger than I ever thought it would be. I've been digging into things, and it's worse than I imagined. I don't know who to trust anymore." She could see the frustration and fear in his eyes, but also something deeper, a sense of betrayal, like he had crossed a line he couldn't come back from. It was as if the weight of his actions had finally hit him, and the man who had always been so strong, so unwavering, was now crumbling in front of her. "I don't understand," Rachel whispered. "You said you were investigating corruption in the department. But what if you've been too close to it? What if this whole thing has compromised everything you've worked for?" Elliot shook his head, his hand gripping the doorframe as if trying to anchor himself. "I never thought it would come to this. I thought I could handle it, keep it under control, but now," he paused, running a hand through his hair, frustration evident in every movement. "Now it's like I'm part of something I didn't even see coming. I'm not sure what's real anymore, Rachel." His words hit her like a punch to the gut. She had known for a long time that Elliot was driven, that his sense of justice sometimes bordered on obsession, but she never imagined it would lead to this. The idea that he could be caught in the very web he had been trying to expose was unfathomable. Yet, here they were, living in the aftermath of that very reality. Rachel's voice cracked as she spoke. "Do you even realize what this means? If they find anything that links you to this mess, it's over. Not just for you, for us. For everything. Our life, everything we've built, it'll all come crashing down." Elliot's face hardened, but there was a flicker of something that could have been regret, but it was quickly masked by the familiar, unshakable resolve that had always defined him. "I won't let them do this. I won't let them destroy my career, our family, over lies. I'll find a way out of this." Rachel wanted to believe him. She wanted to hold on to the man she had known, the man she loved, but doubt was beginning to creep in, and it terrified her. She couldn't shake the feeling that Elliot had become tangled in something he couldn't untangle. The very people he had trusted, the very department he had spent his life serving, might be the ones to bring him down. "Are you sure you're not too deep in this?" Rachel asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Are you sure you can get out of this without taking everyone down with you?" Elliot flinched at her words, but he didn't back down. "I'm not giving up on this, Rachel. I'm not going to let them destroy everything we've worked for. I will clear my name." But even as he spoke those words, Rachel wasn't sure if she believed them anymore. How could she? The evidence was piling up, and the longer this dragged on, the harder it was to separate fact from fiction. The trust she had once placed in Elliot was beginning to fray, and she didn't know how to fix it. She didn't know if she could. The night stretched on, the silence between them growing heavier. Rachel sat on the couch, her mind racing, while Elliot stood by the window, staring out at the darkened street. The world outside was unchanged, but everything in their lives had shifted. There was no going back now. The investigation was relentless, the pressure mounting, and there was no telling how it would all end. As the clock ticked into the early hours of the morning, Rachel felt a sense of hopelessness settle in her chest. She wanted to believe that Elliot could fix everything, that they could find a way out of this together, but the truth was, she didn't know if they would make it through the storm. Would their marriage survive the fallout of his choices? Would their family be torn apart by the very thing they had once tried to protect? And more than that, who was Elliot now? The man she had known, or someone she didn't recognize? The question lingered in the air, unanswered and ominous, as the night swallowed them. The days that followed were a blur of tension, paperwork, and mounting pressure. Every call, every knock at the door, every time the phone rang, Rachel's heart leapt in her chest, unsure of what news would follow. The community was watching them, watching her. The whispers had become louder, the glares more frequent. Rachel could no longer pretend that things were normal. She couldn't hide behind her old life or even pretend to be the supportive wife she had always been. There were too many unanswered questions. Too much was being kept from her. Elliot was distant, farther away than she had ever seen him. The man who had always been her protector, her confidant, seemed a stranger now. His once steady gaze had been replaced by a look of determination and fatigue, as though he were fighting a battle he wasn't sure he could win. His every movement seemed calculated, as if he were always on edge, always one step ahead, but never able to outrun the inevitable. The house was no longer a home. It had become a place where secrets were kept, and the weight of their future together hung over them like a shadow that couldn't be escaped. Rachel did her best to keep things together for their son, Sam, who had been quieter than usual, sensing the change in the atmosphere. But no matter how hard she tried to reassure him, the unease she felt seeped into every interaction. She couldn't keep pretending that everything would be okay when she was constantly on the edge of breaking down herself. Every day, a new bombshell seemed to fall, each more devastating than the last. Then came the letter. It arrived late in the evening, the envelope thin and marked with the emblem of the state prosecutor's office. Rachel's heart dropped as she held it in her hands. The weight of the letter felt heavier than any of the others that had come before. With a trembling hand, she opened it, and as her eyes scanned the words, she felt the floor beneath her give way. It was a formal summons, ordering Elliot to appear before a grand jury to answer for charges of corruption, abuse of power, and conspiracy. The letter was clear in its demands: failure to comply would result in immediate arrest. Rachel's breath caught in her throat as she reread the letter. A grand jury? This was no longer an internal investigation. This was a public matter. The press would get involved. The community would tear itself apart, and Elliot would be at the center of it all. Her world, their world, was about to explode. She rushed to find Elliot, who was in the kitchen, pouring himself a drink, something he had done far too often in the past few days. When he saw her standing in the doorway, holding the letter, his face drained of color. He knew what it was before she even said a word. "This is it, isn't it?" Rachel whispered, the words barely leaving her mouth. "The end. They're going to put you away." Elliot remained silent, staring at the letter in her hand. His face was grim, and for the first time since all of this had started, he looked truly defeated. "It's not over, Rachel," he said quietly. "I'll fight it. I'll do whatever it takes." But Rachel could see the cracks. She could see how much the pressure had worn him down, how much he had given of himself to this fight. And for the first time, she wasn't sure if he had enough left to win. The fight had turned from one of justice to a battle for survival. The man she loved, the man who had always been so certain of his cause, was now fighting to keep his freedom, his name, and his dignity intact. And with every passing day, it seemed less and less likely that he would succeed. Later that night, after Sam had gone to bed, Rachel sat across from Elliot, both of them surrounded by the mess of legal papers, phone calls, and unanswered questions. The silence between them was thick, heavy, and Rachel could feel the weight of their shared grief in every passing moment. Elliot's eyes were bloodshot from sleepless nights, and his hands shook as he shuffled through the papers in front of him, pretending to organize them when, in reality, they were only reminders of his crumbling life. "I don't know how much longer I can do this," Rachel finally spoke, her voice raw with emotion. "I don't know how much longer I can pretend that everything's fine when it's falling apart around us. I'm scared, Elliot. I'm so scared." Elliot's gaze softened, but it was quickly replaced by the cold determination he had worn like armor for so long. "You don't need to be scared. I'll get through this. I'll make sure this doesn't destroy us." Rachel shook her head. "But I'm already feeling destroyed. I'm already losing you." Her voice cracked as she spoke the words aloud for the first time. "I don't know if I even recognize you anymore. You've changed, Elliot. This obsession with fixing things, with proving your innocence, it's consuming you. And it's consuming us, too." Elliot stood up abruptly, pushing his chair back with more force than necessary. He turned away from her, his back rigid. "You don't understand, Rachel. This is bigger than us. This is about the truth, about exposing what's been happening in the department for years. I can't walk away from that." Rachel stood as well, her chest tight with frustration. "But what about us? What about our family? We've lost ourselves in this fight, Elliot. We've lost who we were. Who we are." He didn't respond at first. The silence stretched between them, more suffocating than any words could be. Rachel's heart felt heavy as she watched him, seeing not just the man she loved but the man she feared he had become. She could see the toll it was taking on him, on them both, and she wondered if there was any coming back from it. The phone rang, breaking the tense silence, and Rachel instinctively reached for it. The number was unfamiliar, but the voice on the other end sent chills down her spine. "Mrs. Morgan," the voice said, a cold, professional tone that sent a shock of dread through her. "This is Detective Harrison. We need to speak with you regarding the ongoing investigation into your husband. It's time you came in for questioning." Rachel's heart stopped. She glanced at Elliot, who was already shaking his head, his face paling. "No," he muttered. "They can't. Not you too, Rachel. Not now." But the detective on the phone was insistent, and Rachel knew that this moment, this turning point, was one they could not escape. The investigation had now reached a point where there was no more room to hide, no more room for denial. Their lives, their future, had been irreparably altered. The consequences were no longer just about Elliot's career, they were about everything they had built together, everything they had hoped for, now hanging by a thread. Rachel hung up the phone, her hands trembling. She could feel the walls closing in. The investigation was now targeting her, and soon the entire town would know. Everyone they had ever known would turn their backs on them. She didn't know how much more she could endure. The fight was no longer just about saving Elliot, it was about saving whatever they had left. And for the first time, she didn't know if they could win. The day Rachel was summoned for questioning came with an ominous quiet. She woke up, her body heavy with dread, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest. The world outside their home felt alien now, as if every step she took carried the knowledge that nothing would ever be the same. She glanced over at Elliot, still asleep beside her, his face drawn with the exhaustion of someone who had been fighting an invisible enemy for too long. It hurt her to see him like this, so lost, so distant, yet so determined to fix everything. But she knew, deep down, that there was no fixing it anymore. Not everything could be repaired. Her thoughts swirled as she sat in the kitchen, staring at the untouched cup of coffee in front of her. The quiet was deafening. It was a strange kind of silence, one that was pregnant with unspoken words, with emotions too complex to express. Rachel had always believed in their ability to withstand any storm, that together they could face anything. But as the hours passed, and the phone remained silent, she couldn't ignore the truth staring her in the face. The storm had already come, and they had been swept up in it. By the time the afternoon arrived, Rachel had already spoken with her lawyer, a kind but firm woman named Christine, who had assured her that they would try to mitigate the damage. But Rachel could tell from the look in Christine's eyes that there was little hope left. The prosecutor was building a strong case, and now, with the police targeting her as well, it seemed like the net was closing in around them. The sense of helplessness was suffocating. The woman who had once been in control of every aspect of her life was now reduced to a mere spectator, watching as everything she loved unraveled before her. When the time came to leave for the station, Rachel found herself unable to take that first step outside. The world felt too big, too dangerous. She hesitated at the door, her hand on the doorknob, unsure whether she was ready to face whatever came next. Elliot stood behind her, his presence a quiet comfort, though she could feel the tension in his body as he lingered in the hallway. "Rachel," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "I never meant for this to happen. I never wanted this for us." She didn't know how to respond. She wanted to scream at him, to demand answers, to make him understand the fear that gripped her heart. But instead, she simply nodded. What else could she say? They had reached a point where words no longer had the power to bridge the growing distance between them. When they arrived at the station, the scene was even worse than Rachel had feared. News vans were parked outside, their cameras and microphones pointed at the door, waiting for the first glimpse of the woman who was now as much a part of the story as her husband. The press had already caught wind of the scandal, and Rachel could feel their eyes on her as she walked past the cameras, the flashing lights blinding her. The reporters' voices were a blur, but the words she heard stuck with her like daggers. "Commissioner's wife under investigation," one of them said. "Family torn apart by corruption scandal." Rachel's heart sank as she entered the building. She had always prided herself on her privacy, on keeping her family's life separate from the public eye. But now, it felt as though every part of her life was being exposed, dissected, torn apart in front of the entire world. She could barely process the weight of it all, the fear of what they would do to Elliot, to her, to their family. Inside the interrogation room, the air was thick with tension. Rachel sat across from two detectives, their eyes cold and calculating. She tried to keep her composure, but inside, she was falling apart. The questions came rapid fire, each one designed to break her down, to force her to reveal something, anything, that could be used against her or her husband. They asked about her knowledge of Elliot's actions, about the people he associated with, about the things she had seen in their home, in his office, in the hours they spent together. It was as though every moment of her life had been scrutinized, every conversation re-examined for hidden meanings, for a clue that would tie her to the investigation. Rachel answered their questions as best she could, but the more she spoke, the more she realized how little she actually knew. She had never asked her husband for details about his work, never wanted to be involved in the gritty politics of his job. She had trusted him completely, and now she was paying the price for that trust. The detectives didn't seem satisfied with her answers, and they pressed her harder, their voices growing sharper. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in on her, and for a moment, she couldn't breathe. Just when she thought she couldn't take any more, the door to the room opened, and Christine, her lawyer, stepped in, a stern look on her face. "That's enough," she said firmly. "We'll take it from here." The detectives exchanged glances but stood up, their eyes never leaving Rachel. She could feel the weight of their suspicion, the certainty in their minds that she was hiding something. But what could she possibly be hiding? Her life had been turned upside down, and she was just trying to keep it together. But no one seemed to care about the truth, only about the story they wanted to tell. As Rachel stood up to leave the room, she felt a chill run down her spine. The detective's gaze followed her every movement, and she couldn't help but wonder, how much longer could they keep playing this game? How much longer could they pretend that she wasn't implicated, that she didn't know more than she was saying? The weight of the entire investigation seemed to settle on her shoulders, and the fear that she might not be able to protect her family, the family she had fought so hard for, was almost too much to bear. When they left the station, Rachel was numb. She didn't speak to Elliot on the way home, didn't know what to say to him anymore. The house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison. They had both been sentenced to lives of uncertainty, of fear, and they had no idea how long they could endure it. Over the next few days, everything started to spiral further out of control. The press never stopped, they camped outside their home, ambushing them whenever they left, twisting their every word. Rachel felt like a prisoner in her own life, unable to escape the constant barrage of questions, of accusations. There was no peace, no safety. The police seemed to be tightening the noose around them, waiting for the perfect moment to bring the full weight of the law crashing down. And then came the unexpected. One morning, as Rachel sat at the kitchen table, trying to make sense of everything, the phone rang. It was Christine, and her voice on the other end was unrecognizable, sharp, urgent. "Rachel," she said, her tone clipped, "there's been a development. I need you and Elliot to come down to my office immediately." Rachel's heart skipped a beat. What now? What had changed? Had they found something? Before she could ask, Christine hung up, and Rachel stood there, shaking, her mind racing. This was it. The endgame had begun. The moment she and Elliot arrived at Christine's office, they were ushered in without delay. Christine looked up from her desk, her face pale but focused. "It's worse than we thought," she said quietly. "But there's also hope. The case against Elliot is much more complicated than they originally thought. There's someone working behind the scenes to clear his name, and if we play our cards right, we might just be able to turn this all around." Rachel couldn't believe what she was hearing. After everything, there was hope. She tried to process the words, but all she could think of was the relief that surged through her, like a rush of cool air on a hot day. It wasn't over yet. They still had a chance. But what came next? Could they trust this mysterious ally? Would it be enough to overcome the wreckage of their lives? Rachel didn't know, but for the first time in weeks, she felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give her the strength to fight on.